Do you remember where you were on September the 11th, 2001? Now, some of you may not have even been born, since that was almost 20 years ago. But those of us who were alive, we know exactly where we were. But what about the day before, which would have been September the 10th, 2001? For most of us, that might just be another day of unrecorded memory. But think for a moment. What would people in New York City have done? How would they have changed their plans for 9/11 if they knew what was about to happen the day before? Here's what one New Yorker wrote in a newspaper article after that traumatic event. He said, "If I could go back to one moment in my life, knowing what I know now, that day would be September the 10th. So I could tell everybody what was about to happen." Well, we might ask ourselves, what if we knew what was about to happen in the future? Now, we feel like you must have some curiosity about what's going to take place in the future, since you're here at this virtual Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses. And we thank you so much for coming to this public discourse. Today, the subject that we're going to talk about is the near and immediate future. Not in the form of some human prognostication, but rather, what does the Bible teach about the future? And we'll narrow that subject just a bit. What does the Bible teach about the future of religion? When we contemplate that question, we recognize that current trends seem to indicate that religion is just gradually fading away like a fog or a mist. And we say that because in many lands, religion seems to have lost its support and influence. Maybe you've noticed that respect for the Bible is waning, and the desire to live by Bible principles, it's diminishing. Yet some people continue to maintain affiliation and membership with religious organizations. Why do they do that? Perhaps for family reasons, or it's a cultural thing for many people. Some like to be identified with a religion to ID their economic standing in the community. It bears mentioning, too, that a growing number of people are actually blaming religion for the ever-increasing terrorism, violence, and prevalent disunity on the earth today. So our question seems to be very relevant. What is the future of religion? And the answer, right away, to some extent, is this. The future of religion depends not on human attitudes, but on Jehovah God and how he feels about religion. Such a strong statement demands scriptural authentication. So let's do that. Let's open up our Bibles to the book of John, John chapter 4, verses 23 and 24. Here's the context. Jesus is speaking to a Samaritan woman in the first century. And in that day, there were many religions, just as there are many religions in our day. And notice his words very carefully. He tells this woman, "Nevertheless, the hour is coming, and it is now, when the true worshipers will worship the Father with spirit and truth. For indeed, the Father is looking for ones like these to worship him. God is a spirit, and those worshiping him must worship with spirit and truth." Now, please note in verse number 23 the reference to true worshipers. That in itself makes a distinction between true religion and false religion. Also in verse 23, Jehovah God's feelings are evident. It indicates he's only looking or interested in those who practice true religion. And the command is given. They must worship with spirit and truth. Now, after reading these two verses, you might say, well, it's easy for God to discern the difference between true and false religion. But how can you and I do that? How could we identify and know that a religion was worshiping God with spirit and truth? Since this is so important to God, he would hardly leave the important subject of religious identification to chance or guesswork. So thankfully, we don't have to guess, but we do need to rely on the supreme authority, God's inspired word, the Bible, which indicates that it sets all matters straight. So let's tap into this supreme authority, the Bible, and locate in our copies Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 through 20. And let's see if we get an inspired answer so that we can make that distinction between true and false religion. Now we note in verse number 15, Matthew chapter 7, Jesus states, "Be on the watch for the false prophets who come to you in sheep's covering, but inside they are ravenous wolves." This is inspired advice that can help someone from being fooled by the charade of a wolf representing false religion disguised as a sheep representing an acceptable religion. How can they be identified? Verse 16, "By their fruits you will recognize them." Please notice this illustration to add understanding to what's been said. Never do people gather grapes from thorns or figs from thistles, do they? Likewise, every good tree produces fine fruit, but every rotten tree produces worthless fruit. A good tree cannot bear worthless fruit, nor can a rotten tree produce fine fruit. And here's the outcome. Verse 19, "Every tree not producing fine fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire." The conclusion in verse 20, "Really then, by their fruits, you will recognize those men." What an informative passage. And it helps us to appreciate that true religion produces good fruit, but false religion produces worthless fruit. Now, what is worthless fruit? It's fruit without value. It's fruit that cannot sustain life. In fact, it's poisonous fruit that actually takes life away. Look again at verse number 19. Does verse 19 answer the question, what is the future of false religion? Yes. Verse 19 makes it clear there is no future in false religion. Soon it's going to be chopped down just like a tree and then thrown into the fire so that false religion and all of its bad byproducts are burned up into non-existence. False religion, then, according to this passage, will soon be eliminated not by humans, but by God. True religion, on the other hand, producing fine fruit, will be preserved and protected not by humans, but by God, and it will thrive and exist for all eternity. Now, this judgment against false religion, it is so strong. Perhaps we should examine some of the accumulated bad fruitage that warrants this judgment. We read earlier that false religion was described as a wolf in sheep's clothing. The disguise has a purpose: to deceive and to mislead. Now, how is this accomplished? Let's explore the thought at Mark chapter 7, verses 7 and 8. Again, we're relying on Scripture inspired by God, beneficial for setting things straight. the context is important here. If you'll glance up to Mark chapter 7 and verse number 1, Jesus speaking to two religious groups, Pharisees and scribes. Now, are they misleading and deceiving? In verse number 6, Jesus applies prophecy to them and indicates that they are hypocrites. What's going to happen to them, Jesus explains in verse number 7. It is in vain that they keep worshiping me, for they teach commands of men as doctrines. And to them he addresses, you let go of the commandment of God and cling to the tradition of men. What worthless fruit is documented in this passage? False religion has hindered people from knowing the truth about Jehovah God and his purpose as clearly taught in the Bible. How do they deceive and mislead? By undermining respect for the Bible while simultaneously promoting human philosophy, teaching the commands of men as doctrine. Examples: the Trinity, eternal hellfire or torment, or the teaching of men that the human soul can't die, that the human soul is immortal. Let's look a little closer at some of this mounting evidence of foul fruitage of false religion. Perhaps the most egregious act being committed by false religion today is documented by John chapter 17 and verse number 26. Let's turn to that, John chapter 17 and verse number 26. Now, here Jesus is prayerfully speaking to his Father, Jehovah God, and we would have to recognize Jesus as the foremost advocate of true religion. And this is what he says in verse 26. I have made your name known to them and will make it known, so that the love with which you loved me may be in them and I in union with them. How does false religion identify itself? By doing the opposite of what Jesus did. He made God's name known and continued to do that. False religion, on the other hand, is not only guilty of failing to acquaint people with the personal name of their Creator, Jehovah, but they have rebelliously removed the divine name from their translations, replacing it with the generic and misleading and uninspired term, Lord. And it's very hypocritical that they would do this, because at the same time, they leave in the personal names of false gods in their translations of the Bible. False gods like Chemosh, Tammuz, Baal, Ashtoreth, Zeus, and Hermes all appear in their translations, but God's name conspicuously absent. It's interesting to note that the Christians in the first century followed Jesus' example, and they are described as a people in Acts chapter 15 who are for God's name, even a people who are called by God's name. Now, besides making Jehovah's name known, Jesus made something else known, and that was the message of the good news of the kingdom was a recurring theme in his ministry. He even pronounced prophetically that just before religion was chopped down and thrown into the fire, he foretold that the good news of God's kingdom would be preached in all the inhabited earth, saturated throughout the planet, for a witness to all the nations, and then the end would come, and that would include the end of false religion. Now, any religion that does not echo the good news of God's kingdom as proclaimed by Jesus and his followers, well, their silence in this regard comes under the category of very bad fruitage. What else does the Bible document as religious bad fruitage? False religion has failed to uphold God's moral standards, especially during a time period that 2 Timothy chapter 3 indicates would be the last days. And part of the traits or characteristic of the last days would be that people have an appearance of godly devotion, but prove false to its power. We're advised to turn away from such individuals. Is there any need to document in this discussion the ungodly behavior of religious leaders today? None at all. They have done that for us, and it has been well publicized. The greed, the promiscuity, especially among the clergy, is reported constantly by the news media, prompting one person to say, well, today it's not just that religious leaders don't practice what they preach, but now they are preaching what they practice. What else does the Bible document as religious fruitage worthy of false religion being tossed into the fire of non-existence? Let's consider Matthew chapter 26 and verse number 52. Matthew 26 and verse 52. Jesus says, then Jesus said to him, return your sword to its place, for all those who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Jesus was about to be arrested and led to his execution. And if there was ever a time that would justify fighting, some might reason this would be it. But he told his followers, no, you don't use the sword or you will perish by the sword. Now we might ask the question, to what extent has false religion promoted values that encourage warfare or conflict? Please turn to Revelation chapter 18 and verse 24, which provides a stunning answer. Revelation chapter 18 and verse number 24. After describing in detail the role of false religion in world affairs, the indictment is made in verse number 24. Speaking of false religion, it says, yes, in her was found the blood of prophets and of the holy ones and of all those who have been slaughtered on the earth, indicating that every drop of blood ever spilled in conflict stains the garments of false religion. False religion is unrepentantly guilty of crimes beyond what we perhaps can even fathom. Now, if you think, after reviewing some of this evidence, that false religion merits removal by God, you might also be wondering, exactly how does the Bible describe the tree of false religion that will be chopped down and thrown into the fire? Well, the book of Revelation, it lives up to its name, and it reveals exactly how this is going to happen so that we can even more clearly know the future. Turning to the book of Revelation chapter 17, we'll note verse number 1. Revelation chapter 17 and verse number 1. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, come, and I will show you the judgment on the great prostitute who sits on many waters. Now, who is this great prostitute? Does she have a name? And what are the waters that she is sitting on? Well, you glance down to verse number 5, and the name of the prostitute, it's On her forehead, it says, was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the disgusting things of the earth. So she is the source of all immorality and of all disgusting things that take place on the earth. And her name is Babylon the Great. Now you notice it said she was in verse number 1, sitting on many waters. So we look down in verse number 15, chapter 17, and verse number 15. And there it states, he said to me that the waters that you saw where the prostitute is sitting mean peoples and crowds and nations and tongues. Babylon the Great, then, this world empire of false religion, is drawing support and dominating people or waters all across the globe. Now let's go back to Revelation chapter 17 and verse number 2. Prostitutes have clients. Who are the clients of this great prostitute named Babylon the Great? Revelation 17 and verse 2 states, with whom the kings of the earth committed sexual immorality, and the earth's inhabitants were made drunk with the wine of her sexual immorality. She has alliances with all the kings of the earth, and that is why she is known from Jehovah's viewpoint as a great prostitute. In verse number 4, she has enriched herself, and again in verse number 5 of chapter 17, her name, Babylon the Great. Now, can we specifically identify Babylon the Great? Not a political empire, because she has clients who are the kings of the earth. She can't be a commercial empire. She does business, according to the Bible, with the merchants of the earth. Our final clue for the identity of Babylon the Great is found in Revelation chapter 18 and verse number 23. Revelation 18:23. And please peruse that verse and notice at the end of verse 23, it says, and by your spiritistic practices, all the nations are misled or were misled. Who does Babylon the Great picture? The combined false religions of all the world. Now, what happens just before false religion is destroyed? The Bible prophetically indicates, and this is a scripture or a prophecy that we are seeing undergoing fulfillment at the current time, Revelation chapter 16 and verse number 12. Revelation 16 and verse 12. The sixth one poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its waters were dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the rising of the sun. So prior to the destruction of Babylon the Great, verse 12 indicates that her waters, the waters that support her and enrich her, are drying up. And what do we see happening today? Churches and ministers have lost the respect and the support of the masses. And this is a clear indication that God is going to soon execute judgment on false religion, completely destroying her. In fact, in Revelation chapter 17 and verse number 16, it indicates exactly how God is going to accomplish this. Referring to the political elements as 10 horns and a wild beast, it says, and the 10 horns that you saw and the wild beast, these will hate the prostitute and will make her devastated and naked, and they will eat up her flesh and completely burn her with fire. For God put it into their hearts to carry out his thought. Yes, to carry out their one thought by giving their kingdom to the wild beast until the words of God have been accomplished. So God uses the nations and the kings of the earth to execute and bring Babylon the Great to nothing. And we see the sequence of how this happens. First, in verse 16, she's devastated. All of her wealth and possessions and property taken away from her. How is she left? Naked. And then what happens? They eat up her flesh, and then they completely burn her with fire. It's as if to say, when we take all these verses together, Revelation is saying that the tree is about to come down. Timber, the expression often is said to warn people that the tree is coming down. And it's not going to be chopped down because people make it happen, but it is Jehovah's will to bring false religion into complete non-existence. Now, do you recall our opening question? What if you knew something about the future that could change lives? What would you do with that knowledge? Now, please think back to Jesus' words in John chapter 4 and verse number 23. And there it indicates that true worshipers will worship God with spirit and truth. Now, we want to please God, so we take into consideration his view of false religion and his view and feelings towards true religion. So if God disapproves of a religion and we continue to associate with that religion, wouldn't it also affect the way God views us personally? Here's a command that we're encouraged to heed in the Bible at Revelation chapter 18 and verses 4 and 5. Revelation 18, verses 4 and 5. I heard another voice out of heaven say, "Get out of her, my people, if you do not want to share with her in her sins, and if you do not want to receive part of her plagues. For her sins have massed together clear up to heaven, and God has called her acts of injustice to mind." Doesn't that motivate us to reject anything in our life that reflects the spirit or the influence of false religion? We're told to get out of Babylon the Great, not just to become atheist or to resign affiliation or membership from a religious organization, but to get out of false religion and get in to the true worship that God appreciates. And he's looking for such ones that will worship him in spirit and truth. Now, it's interesting, too, the context here of Bible prophecy indicates that we're living in the last days. Jesus' disciples ask a question, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your presence and of the conclusion of the system of things? And Jesus indicated later in that same prophecy that the conclusion would come to an end with an event that he called the Great Tribulation. And that Great Tribulation will begin with the destruction of false religion. Now, what's going to remain after false religion is removed? True religion, and those who worship God with spirit and truth. And this is because it is Jehovah and Jehovah alone who determines the future of religion. Now, if you knew the future, would it change how you live your life? We would almost all agree the answer is absolutely yes. So may our knowledge of the future and the future of religion move us all to do all that we can to continue in the worship of Jehovah with spirit and with truth today and tomorrow and for all eternity.